is it like for someone who's a first-time deputy? And to join us in that conversation is the Reverend Jimmy Bartz, who is from St. John's Episcopal Church in Jackson Hole, Wyoming.
Yes.
Other people may remember you from THADS, because I know you from when you were in Los Angeles, and THADS out in Los Angeles. Welcome to Inside General Convention.
Thank you. Really happy to be here with y'all.
So, now did you have the y'all before Texas, or is that
I did. I actually was ordained here in the Diocese of Texas, here in the city of Austin.
Really? So this is like a coming home for you.
It is. I spent 3 years here as the campus minister at the University of Texas, and then 15 in Southern California, and I've been in Wyoming for 2.
And tell me, what's it like to be a first-time deputy to convention?
It's interesting. I think there's a pretty steep learning curve for some of the legislative process. Yeah. So there's a lot of reading, a lot of patience required. I think the House and those who are managing the House of Deputies have been good with instructing us about what exactly is happening and what's going on. But I think for me personally, what I like to get things done. And so sitting in that room and listening to what's going on, sometimes I'm a little frustrated by what appears to be inefficiency. But I can attest to the fact that human relationship is not about efficiency. And so
that is true.
I have to remind myself that this legislative process is about building and strengthening bonds of affection and relationships with different groups of people, and so sometimes that work is slow.
On our first show, on the first day, we asked both Bishop Curry and President Jennings about what they would imagine to be a good convention if we were at the end of it, and both of them, independent of each other, both of them said the process. Yeah. That the process heard people, that people felt heard, that nobody felt that they were left behind, and that even if you don't agree on the decisions, that there was a process by which you were part of it. Do you feel part of that process?
I do. I think there's been a very generous process, and there's been a lot of patience with allowing different and sometimes dissenting voices to be heard in the House of Deputies, and I expect the same would take place in the House of Bishops as well.
Now, I was walking by earlier today as they were starting to close down the exhibit hall, and as I did so, I wondered, and I saw all the people inside the House of Deputies and all the bishops inside I wondered, what would Jesus say as he walked through this really large convention center? What do you think? What would Jesus
That's
say?
a great question. I'm not really sure. I mean, I think Jesus would be down with the fact that people are spending this time together and leaning toward one another and connecting with one another. And then, honestly, sometimes I struggle with the financial resource that goes into this convention. But, you take the good with the bad in the process, and I think we have a group of people who are committed to making this process better and better. I mean, I think even your presence here is sharpening our ability to communicate the good work of this triennium. So it's nice to see that, really nice.
Now let's talk a little bit about you, if we may. You came from Texas, you ended up in California and you ended up starting a community that was something different. Tell us about that.
I did, yeah. I had the privilege of being a church planner for 10 years that came from a dream of building a church that would reach people who wouldn't otherwise darken the door of one of our traditional congregations. And so in meeting with the Bishop of Los Angeles and other leaders in Los Angeles, they were very permissive and gave me the blessing to with a group of people to go and plant a community that we called THADS for Thaddeus, one of the 12, but we only know Thaddeus's name. We don't know what he's done. And I just had a blast. Really, really hard work, but wonderful, wonderful creative work that has continued to pay a dividend into my life and into my professional life to this day. So now I'm in this place where I can take some of that creative experience that we had at THADS, an eccentric congregation in the Episcopal Church, and to bring that creative experience to a more traditional parish, which is St. John's in Jackson Hole.
And St. John's is by the book, sort of traditional, very, at least when you got there. What's it like now? What are some of the more tangible ways by which you have infused that energy, that creativity, while still being honest and authentic to who St. John's was and is.
Yeah, I think it's really important to honor the history and the DNA of a parish. And so in conversation with the leadership at St. John's, it was like, look, you know of my eccentric background, but you also know that the Episcopal Church, the traditional Episcopal Church, is my native language of religious experience. And so going back to a traditional setting wasn't particularly hard for me, but the ability to take some of the creative programming that we do right now, we're just in, we sort of organize ourselves in themes, and our summer theme is Dreaming Big Dreams. So about a month ago, we gave each person who comes to we actually have 3 churches in the summertime, one in Jackson, one up in Grand Teton National Park, the Chapel of the Transfiguration, and one down in a little town called Bondurant, St. Hubert the Hunter. So we gave each person who comes to church a pillowcase, and on that pillowcase, it encourages them to dream big dreams, both for the church and for their own lives. And so we've had these wonderful dreaming sessions on Monday evening. We're writing our dreams on feathers and in the process of building two big wings, so we'll have a pair of wings to fly with. And the data that we collect in this dreaming process will be the data that we use to create a strategic vision for our churches to go forward with over the course of the next, say, 2 to 10 years.
So instead of sitting down with a consultant in front of a whiteboard and saying, okay, people, we're going to do a strategic planning session, yawn, right, type thing. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but you took what would it look like if it was a bit more creative, right, approach to it?
Yeah.
So using that same sort of philosophy, what would it look like if you took some of that creative energy and you applied it to General Convention?
You know, it's funny because I got an email from Hallie, one of the organizers of the volunteers for General Convention, a couple days after we had posted what we did on social media, and she was like, can we steal this idea for General Convention? And I was like, sure, of course you can, Hallie. If you can get 5,000 pillowcases printed in 3 weeks, you can do it. So, no, I do think that we're moving toward that, and that our church is opening up and sharing in the creative experiences that Fresh Expressions or emerging churches or other missions are bringing some vitality and creativity to the church. So I wouldn't be surprised that it makes it to General Convention and the next triennium, or maybe the one following.
And to that end, though, going back to your congregation, St. John's, where you're doing this dreaming process, is it possible, you think, also to do this dreaming process in a congregation that perhaps doesn't have as much resource, right? A congregation that still wants to dream, but we have a part-time priest and we don't really have. How might you, if you were like their consultant, how would you take that same sort of let's be creative and apply it to a smaller congregation or a congregation with fewer means?
I think oftentimes when congregations are almost completely focused on survival, it's really, really challenging to get them to think creatively. So if I were a consultant in a congregation like that, like many of the parishes that we have in Wyoming, I think I'd move slowly. And I'd probably tell them a few stories and show them a few of the things that we've done, things that really cost no money at all. It doesn't cost us a thing to dream big dreams or to think creatively, but it is, what we've talked about even at St. John's is that it's a bit of a muscle, that spiritual discipline to vision or to dream. Sometimes that's atrophied in us or in our congregations. And so we just need to practice moving it. Or maybe if there's been some trauma in that congregation, you need a little bit of medical, or metaphorical physical therapy, just a little healing touch or something, just to encourage people. So I would just say you move slowly, but absolutely this can be transferred to any size of congregation.
But I think you're right that when you're in a place of anxiety, when you're in a place of fear, how do you dream about something bigger and greater when you're just stuck how are we going to make tomorrow? But I think that's part of faith, isn't it, though? To be able to say look when God came and said to Abraham, hey, pick up everything, you're moving.
Yeah.
What? We're going where?
What? Where?
What?
Right.
Why are we doing that?
Me?
You have the wrong address. Just keep moving. I'm also fascinated, though, by the fact that in both of these congregations, it came from a dream. You're dreaming, and it's perhaps an invitation to dream.
Yeah, and that, that really came from Bishop Claude Payne, who was the bishop of this Texas early on in my career. He asked us to dream some wild dreams, both for our own lives and for our context, for our cohort, our age group. I remember he called together a group of young clergy one time and said, if you could do anything for your cohort of people, your demographic of people, what would you do in the Episcopal Church? And that's when that dream, really got a vision, and it was right down here. My vision for that was not in Los Angeles, but it was in Austin, but it just transferred.
I love conversations like that begin with, what would you do if there were no limits? What would you dream? Just that set aside, like, just for a moment, think of where you could be, rather than where you are right now. Tell us a little bit about your story. Like, you don't, I'm wearing a collar. I don't think I've ever seen you in a collar, quite honestly.
I've got one in the hotel room.
Just in case of an emergency, right? What was your call like? Because there's different calls. What was yours like?
I came from a family that didn't go to church regularly, but my older brother got involved in youth group when I was a kid, and he said, "Hey, you ought to come to youth group, and you ought to, there are a lot of cool people hanging out." And so I did. I always had questions about things spiritual. I got very involved in youth group, and then it was Claude Payne, that former Bishop of Texas, who was rector of St. Martin's Episcopal Church in Houston, where I grew up, and he called me into his office when I was a senior in high school, and I'm sure the words are different, but the way that I hear it in my own mind, the way that I remember the story is that he said, "Look, you're going off to undergrad. You could go to law school or you could go to business school after you finish undergrad, but some of us around here think you might want to consider seminary." And I did, and that just stayed a part of me all throughout my undergraduate education. Then I was able to work in the church for a few years before I went off to seminary. And I think he, early on in my career just gave me some eccentric experience so that I would think broadly about where I might use my leadership in the Episcopal Church, and that moved me from being the University of Texas campus missioner to being an associate at All Saints Beverly Hills, a large resource congregation, to moving into church planning in an eccentric form in the Venice, Santa Monica area of California, and 10 years there, and now 2 in a beautiful rural setting that is the gateway to Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Park. So I've had this opportunity to have a really, really diverse experience. And I should invite you guys to come and spend Christmas with us. It's a pretty special place to spend Christmas.
I think that we could probably be persuaded to go inside Jackson Hole, Wyoming. I am all for that. Producers and everybody else, I am totally for that. But it's interesting, did you always know your vocation, though, was not going to be the traditional country parson type priest?
No, I think, when I went into seminary, I sort of envisioned myself dressed like you're dressed now and sitting in an office with bookshelves. But I think just, practicing those faith disciplines, staying close to my authentic identity, I felt the Spirit has pulled me in some wonderful, adventurous, and somewhat eccentric directions.
What does your spirituality look like? What are some of your prayer practices?
Well, a lot of time outdoors. So I spent a lot of time fly fishing and skiing and hiking and climbing.
And when I was in LA, it was a lot of time in traffic?
It was a lot of time in the ocean.
People
say like, well, LA doesn't have any wilderness, Jimmy, and you're so oriented to the wilderness. And I'm like, no, LA has a lot of wilderness. You just have to be willing to get wet.
So you're out in nature, and that's how you feed your spiritual side?
Yes, both alone and in groups.
Well, that sounds like a lot of fun. Maybe we should do inside St. John's Episcopal Church in Jackson Hole, Wyoming.
I love that.
Sounds
a little
like
Christmas Eve special or something.
Yeah, right? Yeah. I bet you guys do it really well as well.
Yeah, it's great. Oh, it's pretty idyllic.
Well, cool. Well, I hope that you will send me one of those pillows. I want to dream big, too, for the church. I think we should all dream big for the church, and I think that's a good thing for us. And I'm glad that that we continue to have first-time deputies like you, though, that can continue to invite us as a church to not always just be stuck or always look at things one way, but like, hey, what if the Spirit might be over here?
Yeah.
Jimmy Bartz, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure to have this conversation.
Thanks for having me on.
Thanks.